I'll make a start, and then I'll pass you over. Like before, I'm not going to take up too much time, but just a quick introduction to myself and to our speaker tonight. So good evening or good afternoon or good morning, wherever you're coming from. As most of you know, my name is Richard Mackenzie, and I'll be hosting, I think this is the 6th talk of this sort of mini series on nutrition and exercise, physiology and metabolism. We're joined by Dr. Gareth Wallis for his talk on dietary carbohydrates and exercise recovery, the effects on metabolism, endurance, performance. Now, most of you will know that Dr. Wallis is a reader in exercise metabolism and nutrition at the University of Birmingham, where, a bit like me at Brighton, he spent seemingly quite a lot of time of his academic career at Birmingham University. Dr. Wallis completed his PhD also at Birmingham in the area of exercise metabolism and nutrition. So a good background from a very good institution and unit. Before moving on, he went on to do his postdoc in a world-leading exercise phys lab under the direction of one of the greats, Professor George Brooks, in the Department of Integrated Biology at the University of California, Berkeley. In addition to this impressive academic background, Gareth has also worked a lot with athletes in the applied setting, and has also spent approximately 3 years in industry working for GSK. So this is a really good, great pleasure to be able to welcome Gareth on for tonight's talk, and hopefully generate a lot of interesting questions towards the end. So just before I pass on, can I just make sure that to Gareth that we turn all of our mics on mute, and if you've got any questions, that you post those on the chat application on Zoom, and time willing, I'll put these to Gareth towards the end of the hour session. So without further delay, I'll pass you over to Dr. Wallis for tonight's talk.
Okay, thank you, Richard. Can everybody hear me okay? Someone
Yes.
give me a thumb? Great.
Yeah, you're good.
Okay, fantastic. Okay, so thank you very much for the invitation. I must say I was quite daunted initially when I saw some of the first few speakers on this this program, but it's been a really enjoyable series of presentations so far, and hopefully I can continue that. So, as Richard said, I'm based in the University of Birmingham, been here for about the last 9 years or so, and what I'm going to talk to you about today is some of the work we've been doing around carbohydrates and exercise recovery. And I think nowadays we think about recovery from different perspectives, very much considering, well, what are you recovering for? And are you recovering for an acute subsequent performance bout, or are you recovering with the aim to enhance the adaptation from the training session? And the nutritional requirements might differ depending on those different scenarios. Today's talk is exclusively focused on the former situation, thinking about, how can we optimize the replenishment of fuel so that we can perform at our best in a subsequent bout several hours later. Before I start, I just want to disclose where some of the funding is coming from to support some of the work in the lab over the last few years. And before getting into the detail, I thought I'd give you a little overview of I guess, what my interests are, and also who's currently in Birmingham working with me at the moment. So I've had a kind of long-standing interest in how the diet and also nutrition interact with exercise, and how that interaction affects human metabolism. Most of my interests and most of the work that we do is looking at how can we manipulate some of the metabolic factors that underpin athletic performance, and particularly endurance type performance. And so the majority of what we've been focused on is around that. But there is sometimes some crossover into other aspects of science, particularly around metabolic health. And so some of the work that I have done over the years has been in that area as well. The focus today is obviously around the performance side of things. This is I guess the current team at the moment. These are all graduate PhD students. So the top two, Tim and Ollie, have been around for 2 or 3 years now, and they've been really spearheading the work in carbohydrate nutrition, which is, I guess, my long-standing love. And then in the last year, we've had Caroline and Israel join the group, who are kind of building on some areas of interest that I have. And there's some past people as well, alumni, if you like, all who have made different contributions to some of the work that I'll present. And I'll try and call out the people who've been involved in the studies along the way. So more specifically then about today, to try to distill it down to two objectives. The first part of the presentation, I want to focus on looking at how dietary carbohydrates are metabolized during the post-exercise period. And that's going to include some of our own work and, of course, reference to some of the work of others. And then move towards taking that understanding of metabolism and looking at I guess the potential that may translate into functional implications on exercise capacity or performance based on metabolic responses. And I should say that this is mainly laboratory-based performance trials rather than field studies at the moment. So we'll start with the metabolic side of the talk, although there will be metabolism in the second part as well, so I shouldn't say that. I guess the brief refresher around carbohydrates and metabolism for those who aren't so familiar. This is just a slide of the dietary, depicting the dietary carbohydrates that we would consume in our diets. And so at the top we have starch, which we'll find in bread, pasta, rice, etc., which is essentially glucose molecules, either as long chains or as branched structures. And ultimately, when they are digested, they ultimately become the monosaccharide glucose, which is subsequently absorbed. We also have disaccharides in the diet, lactose, maltose, and sucrose, with sucrose and lactose certainly being the most common, lactose being the milk sugar consisting of galactose and glucose, and sucrose or table sugar consisting of glucose and fructose. And ultimately, these disaccharides are also digested in the intestine, and our final endpoint, if you like, for absorption is one of these three monosaccharides: galactose, glucose, or fructose. So that's what gets into the circulation. That's really what the body's exposed to, and so I think it's certainly been a big interest of mine to sort of study those isolated monosaccharides to see, how do they impact on metabolism. And I should never forget to state that, of course, fiber as a carbohydrate. So that final point of absorption takes place in the small intestine for these monosaccharides, and there are essentially two different transport processes. And this is a fairly simplified schematic of that. But both glucose and galactose are initially transported into the intestinal cell via this sodium-dependent glucose transporter 1, and then subsequently transported into the bloodstream, which would be the hepatic venous circulation via glucose transporter 2. Fructose, the third monosaccharide, on the other hand, is absorbed via this glucose transporter 5, and then follows the common pathway of GLUT2. And I'll come back to that later because it becomes somewhat relevant. This is, I guess, a very simplified schematic of carbohydrate glucose metabolism in the resting state. We have a pool of glucose in the bloodstream depicted by the blue here, and our blood glucose levels, blood sugar levels, if you like, usually around 5 millimoles per litre. And of course, the brain and other tissues have an obligatory requirement for glucose. And so glucose utilization is occurring continuously. And to avoid a fall in blood glucose, we have a release of glucose from the liver, which comes from the breakdown of liver glycogen. It's important for many reasons to maintain the blood glucose concentrations within a tight range. And so when we consume glucose-containing foods, that's obviously a challenge to the glucoregulatory system. So we have glucose coming in from the intestine. And some of that will be acted by the liver in a process called first pass hepatic extraction, and some will escape the liver and enter the systemic circulation. The rise in blood glucose levels, of course, will cause an increase in the release of insulin from the pancreas. And the insulin has a number of actions that serve to try and reduce blood glucose levels. The first is that the process of glycogenolysis in the liver will be stopped. And then we'll also have an increase in liver glycogen synthesis and a stimulation of GLUT4 translocation to the muscle plasma membrane to increase glucose uptake into muscle. And that will allow for glycogen synthesis, for example, in muscle. And of course, in the post-exercise period where muscle glycogen is low, the resynthesis of glycogen is important for the restoration of energy levels. And in that short term after exercise, there is some residual GLUT4 at the plasma membrane as a result of the exercise bout. And on provision of glucose, that can help to take up glucose from the circulation. But as that subsides, the insulin stimulation from the glucose serves to maintain the stimulation of glucose uptake from the blood to help with glycogen synthesis post-exercise. The two other monosaccharides that I mentioned at the beginning are different in that there isn't an appreciable capacity for utilization by a fructose or galactose that we know of in skeletal muscle, at least in humans, in the sort of concentrations that you might typically see in the bloodstream. And indeed, the main metabolic fate for fructose and galactose is actually metabolism in the liver. And depending on the metabolic status of the liver, that may be directed towards glycogen synthesis or even glucose production or lactate production, depending on what the demands of the peripheral system are. So the first kind of study I wanted to talk about was just to sort of set the context here, because I've been very interested for a long time in how these different sugars are actually metabolized in the post-exercise period. And of course, you know, there's plenty of literature out there, but this study by Blom is a very nice one to start with, because they took a group of recreationally active men, exercised them to exhaustion to reduce muscle glycogen levels. And then on different occasions fed them different sugars. And I'm just highlighting the fructose and the glucose conditions today. So they fed glucose or fructose at 0.7 grams per kilogram body mass 3 times during a 6-hour recovery period. And they're interested in, you know, what happens to muscle glycogen levels. They're able to show that the glucose, when that was consumed, glycogen synthesis, the average synthesis rates are around 5.8 millimoles per kilogram wet muscle per hour. And if you consume the fructose, the glycogen synthesis rates were approximately half. And I've depicted the fructose with a dashed line there because so to indicate that it's likely to be indirect glycogen synthesis. And this kind of makes sense because I've already said that fructose is predominantly metabolized in the liver. So that may well be then that subsequent glucose production or even lactate production is it's contributing to that glycogen synthesis, but that's proceeding at a slower rate. So from this, we would certainly say that glucose, and indeed glucose polymers, so short chains of glucose, are probably optimal for stimulating post-exercise muscle glycogen synthesis. One of the things that became very apparent when I got interested in this area is that we know very little about the other monosaccharide, galactose. And we had the opportunity to look into this last year in a bit more detail. And so this is just some pictures of one of the labs in Birmingham, with me waiting on in the background, and the exerciser is one of the PhD students I mentioned, Tim Podlegar, and the experimenter there is Brandon Shad. And Tim and Brandon work very closely together on this project, where we were interested in looking at galactose-mediated glycogen resynthesis after exercise. And I should acknowledge also the collaboration of Professor David Rowlands at Massey, who's been heavily involved in this as well. So this is the study design that we've used, and it's quite consistent with several of the other designs we've used that I'll talk about, and many other projects in the past. We had 9 recreationally active people, moderate fitness level, I would say. People who do these studies know the challenges of getting very highly trained individuals to volunteer and experience the different procedures we use. But these were all capable individuals. They came to the lab on 3 occasions. Well, 4, they did a full familiarization first, I should say. They performed a high-intensity intermittent cycle test to exhaustion in order to reduce muscle glycogen levels. And then they underwent a 4-hour recovery period where they were fed glucose only, galactose only, or a combination of galactose and glucose, and that was 1 part galactose, 2 parts glucose. And we fed a dose of 1.2 grams per kilogram per hour, which is in line with some of the expert recommendations for speedy refueling after exercise. And this was fed at frequent intervals throughout the recovery period. We took biopsies immediately after the exercise, the exhaustive exercise, and at the 4-hour recovery point. And then they got on the bike and did a subsequent exercise bout, although I won't talk about that data today. So this is the sort of key results on the for the galactose comparison. I'll come on to the final comparison later on. At the moment, I mentioned the gap was around the galactose in the literature. So the black circle, which is the glucose, I've expressed this as the net synthesis over that 4-hour period, and it's expressed as millimoles per kilogram glucosyl units of dry muscle here. So we had 155 of the net synthesis, and with the galactose, which I've depicted as indirect synthesis, although we are not sure whether that's entirely true. But regardless, we see a significantly lower rate of muscle glycogen synthesis with the galactose ingestion. So in a way, this is similar to what we see with the fructose, that Blom saw with the fructose and others, that the sugar, if you like, that is predominantly metabolized in the liver seems to be less efficient for muscle glycogen resynthesis compared to a directly a glucose source, which can be a direct precursor for glycogen synthesis. So that kind of makes some sense, but it was interesting to do that study and see that result. So back to the Blom study, and I think again, I'm just using this study to articulate more general points. There are probably many other studies I could have picked. So this was the data I showed before: the glucose, 0.7 grams per kilogram per hour, and the synthesis rates. They had another condition where they doubled the glucose ingestion rate here, and very interestingly, they showed that this didn't have any effect on the subsequent rate of muscle glycogen synthesis. So it seemed that there was certainly a plateau in the synthesis rates here. Giving more glucose didn't result in more glycogen. And probably over the next sort of 10, 20 years, and nicely summarized in this review from from James Betts and Clyde Williams, we now know that feeding things like glucose polymers within a range of 1 to 1.2 grams per kilogram body mass per hour over a 4-hour period seems to be elicit the maximal rates of muscle glycogen synthesis, at least from orally consumed carbohydrates. So there seems to be a limitation there. But what was interesting is there's some work from 1999 from Eric Richter's group, who of course Eric spoke a few weeks ago on this program, and it only involved 2 participants, but it was still very interesting. They basically had a glycogen depleted leg, and then they conducted a hyperinsulinemic, hyperglycemic after the glycogen depletion. So they're able to raise insulin and glucose levels to exceedingly high levels that you just don't get if you're feeding. And of course, what they're able to show there was extremely high rates of glycogen synthesis, much higher than what's typically seen with feeding. So it suggests that if you can increase availability to the muscle of glucose or carbohydrate, the capacity exists. So it's really about how can you overcome that capacity. And this kind of brings us back to this, this schematic game earlier on. And many of you will be familiar with the work of my former PhD supervisor, Asker Jokendrup, who very nicely developed this idea and demonstrated that if you combine a glucose source and a fructose source, you appear to be able to enhance the delivery of carbohydrate into the systemic circulation, and at least during exercise, that leads to higher rates of energy utilization from that ingested carbohydrate. And it simply seems to be that if you consume glucose, there ultimately becomes a point where absorption is limited. And if you then recruit an alternative transport process by using fructose, you can increase total carbohydrate absorption and delivery. So one of the questions we had towards the end of my PhD many years ago now was, does this concept transfer to the post-exercise period? So could we combine glucose and fructose in large quantities to enhance total carbohydrate absorption and potentially increase delivery to muscle and synthesis of muscle glycogen? So we set up a study whereby we exercised individuals to exhaustion on 2 separate occasions, and they followed this with a 4-hour recovery period of consuming very large amounts of glucose only or combined fructose glucose, again 1 part fructose and 2 parts glucose. What we saw was fairly high glycogen synthesis rates over that 4-hour period. Typically between 40 and 50 is the kind of highest rates generally seen in terms of on an hourly basis. And what we saw with the fructose-glucose combination was actually that there was no difference. So there was no significant difference between these 2 conditions. So we weren't able to show that that fructose-glucose combination increased muscle glycogen synthesis. Of course, I guess the good news is it wasn't any worse because we've given less glucose, so there was always the risk for that. But that didn't seem to be the case. And I think what's quite nice is that in subsequent years, this has been confirmed and extended with different types of sugars by 2 other different studies. So both from Luc van Loon's group in Maastricht, Jorn Trommelen showed at even higher doses of these carbohydrates that glycogen synthesis in muscle was similar between glucose and fructose-glucose combinations. That's by muscle biopsy. And Cas Fuchs also showed using sucrose, which of course is glucose and fructose, this time using magnetic resonance spectroscopy, that again muscle glycogen synthesis appeared to be similar between sucrose and glucose. So it seems to be a fairly consistent finding. And one thing that we speculated upon in the paper for this study was that we may have not given enough consideration to the role of the liver and how that might be different between the post-exercise period and during exercise, where one of the key roles of the liver during exercise is, of course, to supply energy to the peripheral system, working muscles, whereas in recovery, you know, the priority may be in some instances to hang on to some of the incoming carbohydrate to help restore its own reserves, and of course fructose having that capacity to be preferentially metabolized in the liver, maybe that was the case. Several years later, Jacques Descombes, working with the group at Nestle at the time, were actually able to to investigate this concept in a bit more detail using non-invasive imaging of the liver. So again, this magnetic resonance spectroscopy technique. And they had individuals exercise to exhaustion and then followed them over a 6-hour recovery period where they were fed the glucose or a fructose glucose combination. And what they saw was they were able to estimate that glycogen synthesis rates with the glucose condition were around 4 grams per hour. Whereas when you combine the fructose and glucose, the synthesis rates in the liver were almost double, or more than double actually. So that kind of affirms the idea that fructose, when combined with glucose, does seem to preferentially increase liver glycogen stores. And I'm just going to mention again the work from Cass Fuchs here, because they did a really nice study where they used sucrose versus glucose, and they're able to show again that the liver glycogen was higher with the sucrose condition versus the glucose. But as I'd mentioned in the previous slide, they also measured the muscle glycogen in the same study. So that's the build here really from the Descombes, where they isolated just the liver. This second study was able to look at liver and muscle, and they're able to show then that what you have is the muscle glycogen is similar between conditions, but the liver glycogen is augmented with the fructose source. I think one of the things that sometimes gets overlooked with this Descombes paper is that they actually also had a galactose-glucose condition as well. And quite remarkably, they also showed that galactose plus glucose augmented liver glycogen synthesis above the synthesis rates of glucose alone. And this has always been intriguing to me because galactose, of course, is transported through the same transporters in the intestine as glucose. So it suggests that some of this post-exercise period and some of the metabolism happening may not solely be around intestinal absorption, or at least limited by that. Because if it was completely limited by intestinal absorption, then we would have expected the fructose to elicit these responses, but not the galactose condition. Of course, in the Descombes paper, they didn't measure the muscle. And if something is going to be effective, we would want to know that at least the muscle glycogen isn't compromised. And of course, we've already seen for fructose glucose that it isn't. But the outstanding question for us was, what about the galactose glucose combination? And so that was the third trial that we had in our study that I introduced before. So on the left-hand side, this is the glucose data, which you've already seen. So this 155 increase over the 4-hour period. I put a green tick next to the liver because that's the work from Descombes showing that we know liver is augmented with the galactose-glucose combination. So what about the muscle? Well, we didn't see even a matching of the muscle glycogen synthesis compared to glucose. So we actually saw significantly reduced synthesis rates with galactose glucose versus glucose only, which differs from the fructose condition. And you know, there could be several reasons for that, but certainly the increases we're seeing in glucose and insulin don't seem to be as high as you see when you have fructose and glucose. So maybe that's one of the drivers there. But it helped to put some of the pieces of that puzzle together. So that first part of the talk, I guess the summary would be that oral glucose alone is superior to fructose or galactose for short-term muscle glycogen synthesis post-exercise. Oral fructose or galactose, when co-ingested with glucose, appears to be superior to glucose for post-exercise liver glycogen synthesis. But post-exercise muscle glycogen synthesis is similar with glucose and fructose ingestion, but inferior with galactose-glucose co-ingestion. So I guess the take home from that seems to be that if we're thinking about optimizing or near optimizing short-term post-exercise whole body glycogen storage, i.e. liver and muscle, then it's certainly enhanced with combined glucose-fructose combinations or glucose-fructose source combinations versus glucose only. And that's something that we and others articulated a few years ago, and there's been more reviews, several recently from Javier Gonzalez, which is started to incorporate some of the more recent data on that. So that seems to be becoming a kind of clear advantage of the glucose fructose combinations here. And I guess the important thing to think about is, you know, when you get these quite interesting metabolic effects, and those who know me or have worked with me know that I certainly like to get all the metabolic factors worked out before risking performance studies, because I think sometimes if we dive into assessing functional outcomes before we really understand things, then we can sometimes conclude something doesn't work too early because we haven't really worked out the kinks. And so I felt that we probably had enough information to start to move forward with this. And so the second part of this presentation is about some of the work that started to look at functional implications of consuming different dietary carbohydrates for subsequent exercise capacity or performance. I was very fortunate in about 2016 to be contacted by Ed Maunder, who was an undergraduate student at the University of Bath in the UK at the time, who wanted to come and do a master's by research in Birmingham. And we together formulated this question, which was really around this idea of, well, the metabolism seems to be a benefit with fructose combinations. So does fructose-glucose co-ingestion during short-term recovery from exhaustive exercise improve subsequent capacity? And I have to admit, we really didn't know what was going to happen with this. But Ed did a really good job in designing this study and executing it. So this was the design, and we chose to use a running model in this instance because people was missed out of my introduction, but I did spend a year doing my master's in Loughborough, and I learned all about some of the great running models that they developed there. And there's a lot of published literature for us to be able to compare responses with and predict sample sizes, etc. So we chose this model where we had runners run to exhaustion at 70% of VO2 max, recover with either a glucose maltodextrin beverage, this is essentially a glucose beverage, or a fructose maltodextrin beverage. Recover for 4 hours, again, fairly high ingestion rates, and then we asked them to do it again. So they ran to exhaustion again. So it's a pretty tough study to take part in. And our primary outcome here was endurance capacity in that second bout. But we also measured a whole host of other things to try and understand a bit more about what's going on underneath the capacity. So the simple question we had a I guess a simple answer. Was endurance capacity enhanced? Yes, the answer was yes. So on average, the run duration was just over an hour with the glucose condition, and extended by just over 30% with the fructose maltodextrin condition. So this was a fairly large effect, which was quite interesting to see, because it supports this idea that, you know, if you can optimize a metabolic recovery, and let's remember, you know, providing a large amount of glucose alone is likely to be quite beneficial. So this is on top of that. I mentioned we had some other measurements that we used. Well, we obviously used indirect calorimetry to estimate carbohydrate and lipid utilization. And this top figure just depicts the total carbohydrate oxidation during that subsequent bout. And what we can see is that it's fairly similar in total in the first sort of half an hour of this exercise bout. And then it diminishes to the point of fatigue. And of course, the fatigue occurs later in the fructose maltodextrin condition. So this suggests that fatigue is occurring at a time when carbohydrate oxidation is low. This is quite consistent with some of the classic work from Ed Coyle and others, which places a huge emphasis on the ability to maintain carbohydrate oxidation to be able to sustain the workload in these types of studies. And I think one interesting thing to point out is that we actually, because people fatigue at different times throughout this period, we're able to model carbohydrate oxidation over time. And at the point where fatigue occurred in the glucose trial, we were able to show that carbohydrate oxidation was significantly higher in that fructose glucose trial, which suggests that you know, it's really that ability to maintain carbohydrate utilization that was important there. We also used naturally high abundance C13 carbohydrates in the recovery period. And what this enabled us to do was track the oxidation or the utilization of those carbohydrates that were ingested during recovery, how much they were utilized during that subsequent exercise bout. And we were able to show, and it's shown in the bottom figure here, that the exogenous or ingested carbohydrate utilization during that subsequent bout, again, was significantly higher. So that suggests that that was contributing to that total carbohydrate oxidation. And that really helped us to, I guess, conclude that there's likely to be enhanced storage of carbohydrate in recovery, and that's then subsequently available to support that second exercise bout. Now, we had some questions that came from this study. Some of them came up in the review process. Some of them we had on our own. First one was around, well, are these findings reproducible or translatable to other exercise modes? That's always a common question. One was around gut comfort. Those who are familiar with the kind of glucose fructose story, at least during exercise, so some of the benefits, at least compared to consuming glucose only, may indeed be mediated through improvements in gut comfort. And there wasn't any differences or clear differences between the conditions in the Maunder study, but it looked like there might have been a slightly higher, I guess, a trend for higher gut discomfort in the glucose trial. So they need a little bit more work on that to understand whether that could also be an explanatory factor. For those of you who know me, know that I like the methodological side of things, and you know, we had to make some assumptions in our use of the natural high abundance C13 and its subsequent exploitation for measuring exogenous carbohydrate oxidation, because the subjects on average didn't run for much longer than an hour. There are some risks that using this approach in the early stages of exercise may underestimate exogenous carbohydrate oxidation. And that's because some of the 13 CO2 liberated from the oxidation can be temporarily fixed within the bicarbonate in the body, and that may take up to an hour, some have reported, to become equilibrated such that what you're measuring at the breath is actually what's being produced at the level of the muscle. So we had some questions around that. And then, of course, you know, there are some people who are interested in this debate about ecological validity of time to exhaustion and whether we should be using time trials, etc. So this is the exercise performance question that was also relevant to address. I'm pleased that a couple of these questions have actually been answered by another group, and I know that Javier Gonzalez is on this this webinar. This is a paper published from his group last year in the International Journal of Sports Nutrition and Exercise Metabolism, lead author Edward Gray, and I've just put the abstract up here. So they actually looked at feeding glucose fructose in the short-term post-exercise recovery period. They used a cycling model and they used endurance capacity, so a different model. They did a short-term recovery, so a 4-hour recovery period, and they also had another study where they did a 15-hour recovery, so an overnight period. And what they're able to show, and I've just kind of highlighted here, that cycling capacity was greater in glucose fructose versus glucose in both of those conditions. So the short-term recovery, so that provides some reassurance to us that this finding is reproducible and with a different exercise model. But interestingly, they also showed these effects carried over to the morning after. So that kind of suggests also that any effect of, I guess, gastrointestinal disturbance is highly unlikely, because it's unlikely that anything's left in the stomach and in the intestines 15 hours later. So I think this study nicely helped to answer some of those questions. We of course had already started trying to answer those questions as well. So we have our own work area, which I'll show. This has just been published. This is Tim Podlegar's second PhD study. Just been published in Frontiers in Nutrition in the last few weeks. So the question here was, does fructose glucose co-ingestion during short-term recovery from exhaustive exercise improve subsequent exercise performance? So this is moving that capacity to a performance condition, because of course even the Gray paper, it was still exercise capacity. So in this project, we had 8 trained cyclists and triathletes. They performed high-intensity intermittent cycling to exhaustion. They had the 4-hour recovery period that I've talked about before, glucose-only condition or fructose maltodextrin condition. And this time we had a 1-hour steady-state exercise bout at 50% peak power, so a little bit lower intensity, followed by a 40-minute time trial. And we selected this exercise model because the model itself has previously been shown to have a fairly good reproducibility. And that was work from Kevin Correll in his PhD in Birmingham. So we wanted to have a protocol that we could be comfortable with in terms of its reproducibility. The time trial, obviously, we included for the validity perspective in terms of the ecological validity. And we wanted this 1-hour steady state exercise bout to be able to get a better handle on the exogenous carbohydrate oxidation. So we had the natural high abundance carbohydrates in this again. But what we also did in these participants on a different occasion was actually try and estimate the time it takes, and in these conditions, for the recovery of CO2 that it has a carbon label to actually reach equilibrium, such that what we measure at the breath is actually being is reflecting what's coming out of the muscle. And to do that, we used a C13 bicarbonate ingestion and use that to try and estimate, I guess, the turnover time of the bicarbonate pool, so that we knew a time when the pool was completely turned over. We also had a full familiarization trial in this, where they consumed low natural abundance C13 carbohydrates in recovery, and then in the subsequent bout, we used that as a background correction for the production of to ensure that when we measure exogenous carbohydrate oxidation, it isn't contaminated by C13 that was already in the muscles prior to the exercise, because that can be quite an important confounder. And I should give a shout out at this point to Ollie Odell, who was one of the students I mentioned at the beginning. He's just had a paper come out today in MedSci looking at lactose versus sucrose oxidation during exercise. And one of the things we also did in that study was look at whether using a water trial, which is commonly used as a background correction for endogenous 13-CO2 production, is actually the most accurate way. And we've shown that it can be quite inaccurate, and to get accurate measures of exogenous carbohydrate oxidation, at least when using naturally high abundance C13 carbohydrates, you really should use what we would call an authentic control condition, so a low natural abundance 13C carbohydrate trial. Anyway, that's a digression. So what happened to performance, which is our primary outcome? Well, nothing. We found that the trials were incredibly reproducible on average. So we saw no additional benefit in terms of an improvement in time to complete that time trial with fructose maltodextrin versus glucose maltodextrin. So, of course, you can imagine this a little bit disappointing when you already have two studies that are looking promising, but then you don't get what you're necessarily expecting. But this is science; you don't always get what you want. Just to show you what happened with the elimination of the ingested 13C labeled bicarbonate. This is just the elimination of the excretion over time in one individual, just to give you an example. And this is just modeled using the Dmax approach. And what you can see is that there's a kind of plateau in the elimination, which means that it's all been excreted after about just over 20 minutes. And so what we're able to show here is, and this probably has implications for people doing this type of work in the future potentially, is that exogenous carbohydrate oxidation rates can probably be accurately determined from as early as 30 minutes after carbohydrate ingestion, whereas previously we tended to wait for at least an hour. So that was a kind of side issue. We obviously then calculated exogenous carbohydrate oxidation during that subsequent bout, and consistent with the Maunder study, we did see significantly higher ingested carbohydrate oxidation during that subsequent exercise bout, as shown by this figure here, with the fructose maltodextrin condition. But I guess one of the key differences is that total carbohydrate oxidation wasn't clearly higher with fructose maltodextrin versus glucose. And that may be because the intensity is a little bit lower and certainly sustainable. So we didn't create a situation where it became unsustainable, such that you could only continue if you had you could maintain carbohydrate oxidation. So we think that it could well be that the reductions in intensity here might be part of the explanation that we didn't see a subsequent increase in performance here. And you can see that total carbohydrate oxidation is very similar at the 60-minute time point, which sort of indicates that carbohydrate availability may have been similar between the conditions at that time point. And that's somewhat supported by the exogenous data, which shows that it's kind of diminishing over time. And so either they're just converging. And so this model might have created essentially a convergence where at the start of the time trial, there's no major differences metabolically, which then translates into no difference in performance. So that's just one of the potential ideas there. And we think that there's probably still some some work to do to tease out the kinks, particularly in a performance context. So I had those few questions that I posed. Are the findings reproducible and translatable to other exercise modes? Well, certainly yes. For exercise capacity, seems to be the case. We don't think the gut comfort is a big issue. As I said, it wasn't significantly clear in the Maunder paper. No gut comfort differences in the Gray paper, and also in Tim's work, we really see no differences between the two conditions. We don't think that's so important, at least in our hands. The question about validity of exogenous carbohydrate oxidation, probably okay from 30 minutes. So at least one of the time points in the Maunder paper was clearly valid. And what about exercise performance? Well, no, not yet, I guess, is the answer to that one. So if we summarize the second part of the talk, I think that has shown that oral fructose glucose during recovery increases exogenous carbohydrate oxidation during subsequent exercise. The potential for ergogenic advantage versus glucose-only carbohydrate sources is certainly there, and there's two studies that support that. I think, and as with all of these things, this is reasonably early days in this area, and probably more precise specifications and designs need to be investigated to really understand what conditions may benefit from post-exercise mixed sugars intake and what may be less beneficial. But from a metabolic perspective, I think the glucose fructose data are fairly clear, and the galactose glucose data also are probably clear now in the sense that it may be less effective. But some of these functional translation probably needs a bit more work. So I'll just remind you of the objectives and hopefully convince you that they're somewhat achieved. So the first one was to describe how different dietary carbohydrates are metabolized during the post-exercise period. I was fairly focused on the monosaccharides here, but clearly the data suggests that combinations of fructose glucose appear to benefit short-term post-exercise liver and muscle glycogen storage. The second one was to discuss potential functional implications of consuming different dietary carbohydrates for subsequent exercise. So I think what we've seen is that the combinations of fructose glucose appear to benefit subsequent exercise capacity, but not exercise performance, at least in the one condition studied to date. And I think there needs to be more work here. Okay, that's the bulk of the talk done. I think all I have to do is say thank you again to Richard for hosting this, and thank you to everybody who's turned up to listen. And I look forward to any questions that people have.
Great, Gareth, thank you. Hopefully you can now hear me as well, maybe see me as well. I've reclaimed host. A very comprehensive talk. I like the balance between the metabolism stuff, you know, right at the beginning, and then going into what it actually means. So I'm normally quite strict on time, just the guy downstairs is starting to demand more of my time. I have a 3-year-old, so I've got time for a few questions if anyone's got, wants to come through and ask Gareth. But again, big thank you from me. I've just got a few questions whilst I'm waiting for others to chime in if they want to. You might not be able to answer this, obviously, given you're interested in skeletal muscle. But do you know if there's any other ways in which we're getting these sugars, into the system? You mentioned obviously fructose and glucose coming from the traditional transporters in the intestines but is there anything else you know of? So for example, sugars transporting themselves by mass action effect.
Oh, into the bloodstream.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
are we digesting?
Yeah. Well, I guess from a dietary carbohydrate perspective, there is some evidence that when there's some damage, if you like, that in the intestine, that sucrose may be able to get through the intestinal barrier into the circulation, but whether it can be subsequently metabolized, I don't think that's possible, and it usually appears in the urine. So I guess if you take, for example, there is work suggesting that if you consume lactate in a drink, that can get through into the bloodstream, somewhat limited by the dose that you can consume, because tends to have severe GI distress effects when you have high doses that would be meaningful in terms of energy contribution, but certainly the MCTs are there to transport lactate through. So I guess there's some evidence, but not huge amounts.
Is anyone sort of follow on question? I've got another question for Yave's got a question for you, but quickly on, because it's related. Anyone that's done any work with, similar to the mouthwash stuff that was done a little while ago? I don't know if anyone, this is not my area, so sorry if this is of course it's been done, silly question, but if anyone's done any work on the mouth, on sort of absorption with just on, in the mouth, and with combining the different, the different types of sugars you've been looking at.
Oh, I see, whether it can be direct absorption in the mouth itself.
Yeah.
Not that I'm aware of. I mean, there's some obviously that suggests there's some kind of putative receptors that certainly might respond to the presence of carbohydrate. But I have, there are obviously things like studies in, for example, caffeine that show buccal absorption. But I haven't seen anything. But I'm there to be corrected if anyone knows.
Yeah, I'm glad you haven't, because I felt almost silly wanting to ask that question, because I thought it would just be a natural yes. Of course, it's been done. I'll move on to Yave. He's got a question. Do you think that the fate of galactose seems to? Oh, someone's just asked another question as I was asking that one. Seems to me mainly as glycogen rather than release into the circulation as glucose.
Says, why do you think the fate of galactose is to be mainly as liver glycogen rather than release into the circulation of glucose?
Let me, do you understand the question? Certainly not as I've read it out, but I could maybe ask Yave to ask it directly, if he can.
Sorry, sorry for the poorly worded question. So clearly galactose doesn't seem to be galactose glucose co-ingestion doesn't seem to be as effective for muscle glycogen resynthesis. So I just wondered if you had any ideas on why galactose seems to be retained in the liver predominantly, whereas perhaps fructose isn't quite so much, or what your thoughts are there.
Oh, I see what you mean. Yeah. I don't know whether it's necessarily differential fate from the liver perspective of fructose versus galactose. I think the difference in effect on the muscle is probably more driven by the lower glucose and insulin stimulation that we seem to have seen with the galactose versus at least studies that have compared fructose and glucose. So I think what we're seeing is possibly the effect is because the stimulation for muscle glycogen synthesis is less fundamentally with that. I don't know if that's answering the question or not, but yeah.
Great, thank you, Gareth. I don't know if you wanted to follow up with that, Yave.
No, yeah, thanks, sir.
Lovely,
yeah.
Thank you. Now James Morton had a question. James, do you want to come on and ask that directly rather than me trying to butcher the question and get it wrong like I did with the previous one? No, he's feeding the kids.
Yeah.
So I don't.
My view is that so it's this debate of capacity versus performance. I guess it depends what you're interested in measuring, and if you are more interested in understanding is the fuel availability a fundamental determinant, then you would be better off having a fixed intensity sort of time to exhaustion, because it's a better model to study that. And I think that probably does have a lot more relevance than we previously appreciated, or some have and some have dismissed, because in many competitive situations, it is that ability to sustain high power outputs, which could be fuel availability or accessibility limited, that's important. And so, I always say to my students when I introduce this kind of debate of capacity versus performance, that I don't really have a strong, I don't get into the argument because I don't have a particularly strong view. I think you select based on what your question is and what you're hoping to demonstrate, because I think you can argue that both approaches have validity in different circumstances. But certainly the time trial sort of model is probably more complex in terms of the ultimate determinant of the outcome than a fixed intensity. So I think with that knowledge, you can sort of use that to design your studies depending on what you're interested in, but you also have to be then open about what your study does say and what it doesn't say.
Great, thank you. Sorry to put you in there, James. You're feeding the kids at the same time. That's exactly where I need to go. So I need to draw it to a close. But again, Gareth, great talk. Really, really inspirational. And some of the stuff you're doing is really interesting. Hope to catch up with you sometime in the near future, face to face, rather than over Zoom. Thank you for everyone else for joining in today. Just keep looking on Twitter to see what's coming up next. We've got a couple of more talks from the States coming up in the next few weeks, so lots of more interesting things coming up. But thank you again to Gareth for today. Really, really great having you on board. Thank you. Take care, everyone.